Welcome to my channel. Tonight, I will tell you the story of Miss Marple and a simple hairbrush holding a single strand of hair. To others it was nothing, but to her it was the only clue to a murder hidden beneath layers of lies and silence. From that strand, she would unravel the truth no one wished to see. Let's begin. Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. The morning began with the kind of promise that only an English spring could conjure. The village of St. Mildred's basked beneath a sky of porcelain blue, the hedgerows dusted with new green, and the soft scent of lilac drifting from gardens that had only just woken from winter sleep. On the village green, bunting fluttered lazily in the breeze, stitched together by industrious hands for the annual spring charity fair. There was the clink of teacups in the parish hall, the hum of polite chatter under the white canvas of the cake stall, and the brisk crack of the croquet mallet from somewhere behind the vicarage wall. Miss Jane Marple arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, her pace unhurried but never dawdling. She had promised Mrs. Banbury a few jars of her gooseberry preserve for the raffle table, and was mildly gratified to see the vicar's wife beam upon receiving them. In her quiet way, she took in everything: the fresh paint on the post office door, the absence of young Thomas Biddle, who usually helped at the coconut shy, and the rather flushed expression of Mr. Percy Coombs, the bank clerk, who had been spending an unusual amount of time near the fortune-telling tent. It was, in short, a day like many others in St. Mildred's, where nothing of great significance ever happened, or so one might believe. Yet, as Miss Marple well knew, such placid surfaces often concealed the most curious undercurrents. At precisely 11, the fair's gentle rhythm was broken. A sudden, sharp cry, half alarm, half disbelief, came from the direction of the art exhibition marquee. Conversation faltered. A woman's voice, low and horrified, called for help. Within moments, a ripple of uneasy movement swept through the fair, as villagers turned and drifted toward the source of commotion. Miss Marple, moving with a small, purposeful step, followed in the wake of Mrs. Lenton, who was muttering about young people fainting over nothing these days. The marquis's entrance flapped in the breeze, and inside, a curious hush had fallen. The rows of amateur watercolors and oil paintings hung neatly on their easels, but in the center of the room, a small crowd stood in a tight half-circle. There, slumped in a wicker chair meant for the visiting portrait artist sitters, was Mr. Adrian Brent. His silver hair, usually so immaculate, was disarrayed, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. A palette knife lay on the floor near his foot, glinting dully in the filtered light. The vivid blue scarf at his neck, an ostentatious touch he was fond of, was pulled too tight, biting into the skin. His eyes stared at nothing. Someone whispered, "Is he?" But the unspoken answer was already clear. Miss Marple's gaze did not linger on the man's face. There was no need. Instead, she noticed the odd angle of the overturned sketch pad on the nearby table, one corner crumpled as though caught in haste. She noticed also a single strand of dark hair, quite unlike Mr. Brent's silver, resting against the cuff of his cream linen jacket. It was long enough to have belonged to a woman. By now, the more practical villagers were bustling about, some calling for the constable, others ushering the more squeamish outside. Miss Marple allowed herself to be nudged back toward the marquis's entrance, her face composed. It would not do to speculate aloud. Not yet. She knew well that in the next hour, the green would buzz with half-heard rumors, each a small window into the minds and motives of those who lived here. And while others would speak too much, Miss Marple would, as ever, listen, for she had already seen enough to know that Mr. Brent's death would not prove to be a simple, unfortunate accident, and that the single dark strand of hair, so out of place against his pale sleeve, might, in the end, be more dangerous than any weapon. Chapter 2. The village reacts gossip and theories. By noon the bunting drooped as though even the cheerful triangles had heard the news and lost heart. The village green, which an hour earlier had been a picture book of orderly amusements, grew ragged at the edges. The coconut shy untended, the sponge-throwing booth deserted, the raffle table guarded by a single anxious maiden aunt who looked as though anyone asking for a ticket might be attempting a robbery. From the marquee there issued the solemn footfall of those who had business inside, and the purposeful whispers of those who did not, but contrived to have it all the same. Mrs. Banbury stationed herself at the tea urn with the militant posture of a field marshal. "Hot sweet tea is wanted," she declared, pouring with such resolution that saucers trembled beneath her. "It was always tea for shocks during the war. It will be tea now." To each trembling hand she pressed a cup and, with it, a firm opinion. "Natural causes can look quite unnatural," she told a cluster of girl guides. "My cousin Maud's husband went all purple at a whist drive, and people said all sorts. Turned out it was his heart. Men keep their organs in disgraceful condition." "Heart," said Mrs. Linton, gliding up like a well-scented thundercloud. "My dear, one does not turn rope blue at the throat for a heart. Besides, he was—" She stopped delicately. "He was braced up with that scarf like a Christmas parcel." "Mrs. Linton," said the vicar's wife, arriving with a basket of biscuits as though distributing small absolutions, "we must set a tone of calm. Constable Hargreaves has asked for people to keep clear of the marquee." "That's as may be," Mrs. Linton replied. "But people will say what they see, Hester." Mr. Brent's eyes were open. "That is not restful." Miss Marple, sitting slightly apart with her knitting bag in her lap and a paper plate of angel cake untouched before her, did not intrude upon a flow of village conversation. She looked, if anything, a little vague and fleecy, like when the small clouds begin to gather over the hills. Yet her gentle gaze was alert, moving from face to face as the talk slid into channels it had long dug for itself. "Shocking," said Mr. Percy Coombs, the young bank clerk, appearing at the tea table with an expression of injured virtue. His collar was a shade too tight, and the heat had brought out a high color in his cheeks. "Absolutely shocking. Though, between ourselves, Mrs. Banbury, these art people," he made a vague circle with his spoon in the air, "they get into unwholesome habits." "Art people," Mrs. Banbury repeated, sharp as a knitting needle. "Mr. Brent," Percy said, lowering his voice to what he imagined was a confidential murmur, "had all sorts at his cottage. Music in the evening, visitors from town, a gentleman in a velvet jacket and hair like an archangel, and a woman who paints nude ladies with fan, concealing only the worst bits." "Percy!" gasped the vicar's wife, whose biscuits rattled. "Do not." "Miss Clarice Vale," Percy hurried on, gratified to command attention. "She's at the exhibition today. She stormed out just before. Well, before, said the lighting was a disgrace, and the judging a farce. Ask anyone. Miss Vale is a temperamental creature," Mrs. Linton said with relish. "She has eyes like smoked glass and a laugh that would knock a man sideways. Perhaps she knocked Mr. Brent sideways. Men are notorious for going head first where they ought to tread carefully. From a shade of the oak where the fortune-telling tent had been set up, a contrivance of moth-eaten velvet and gilt stars, Madame Zuleika emerged with a handful of charms and an air of battered dignity. Everyone knew she was Mrs. Dodds from the drapery shop in the High Street, but when she put on her turban the village tolerated the fiction. "I felt a disturbance in the ether," she announced. "A line of fate snapped like a weak thread." "Your thread snapped every time it rains, Zuleika," Mrs. Banbury said. "If fate ran to your timetable, none of us would survive a Tuesday." The constable himself, a large, slow man who had given up his youth's ambition to be a runner for the county, and now ran only to the pub when news demanded it, stumped past with a notebook. "Now, then, ladies," he said, in the tone of a man negotiating a truce. "No cause for panic. Doctor will be along directly. Best to keep clear and keep calm." "The doctor is at Mrs. Ely's lumbago," someone volunteered. "He'll be diverted," said the constable with hopeful gravity. He glanced at Miss Marple, as men tended to do when things grew complicated without explanation. "Afternoon, Mississippi." "Good afternoon, constable," Miss Marple returned mildly, "so very sad." "Yes." He paused, frowning as if concentrating might reduce the number of facts. "A bit of trouble with that scarf at the throat. Could have got tangled. Those artists, they tie things fancy." "Quite," Miss Marple said, and adjusted the tension of her knitting wool. News ran ahead of sense, as it always did. By 1 o'clock, the village had constructed several mutually exclusive histories of Mr. Adrian Brent. In one, he was a romantic sinner whose flirtations had finally produced an angry consequence. In another, he was a benefactor and patron whose generosity had ruined him and provoked desperate creditors. In a third, he was a practical joker who had choked himself as foolish men do with bow ties at weddings. Each story had a different teller and a different moral, and all of them felt uncomfortably plausible, because villages are built of memory and bias as much as brick. At the sweet stall, Mrs. Jarvis leaned over the sugared almonds as though they might eavesdrop. "It was an accident," she confided to anyone who would listen. "I saw him tugging that scarf earlier, and Mr. Brent was always dramatic, everything with a flourish. He probably knotted it too tight himself and swooned. Pride before strangulation." At the haberdashery stall, Mr. Rowe, who kept accounts for half the village and opinions for the other half, wagged a finger. No, the man had debts. He asked me last week about a bridging loan. Said a sale from London hadn't cleared. Mark my words, where there are debts, there are quarrels. "Quarrels," murmured Mrs. Lenton, who had the agility to be present at all conversations. "With whom?" "Well, Mr. Rowe liked to be coaxed. He had a difference with young Thomas Biddle, I believe, about a frame. Thomas lost it, mislaid, and Mr. Brent made a scene. Very theatrical. Young Thomas hasn't shown his face today, has he?" Miss Marple, settling her saucer carefully on the grass beside her, filed this away alongside the earlier observation that Thomas, usually a helpful figure darting from errand to errand, had indeed been conspicuously absent. Young men, she had noticed, seldom managed to be invisible unless they wished it. In the parish hall, a group of exhibitors had gathered in defensive huddle. Miss Clarice Vale, handsome even when angry, smoked a cigarette at the back door, sending stern spirals into clean spring air. "Your village," she told the assembled, "has no appreciation for light, or composition, or modernity. That marquee is an outrage. If my water lily study looks like a poison swamp under canvas, it is not my fault." Mr. Brent admired it, put in a quiet voice. It belonged to Lily Brent, Adrian's niece and housekeeper, who had arrived pale but stubbornly composed, her neat gloves a detail that would have pleased Miss Marple. He said your lilies were like jewels. Did he? Clarice flicked ash like a small declaration of independence. He said many things that were convenient. "Miss Vale," said Mr. Coombs, appearing again now that the safety of company beckoned, "no one is accusing anyone of anything." "Yet," Clarice returned coolly. There was a murmuring then of Mr. Brent's charm, of the evenings when he read poems aloud as though distributing truffles, of his kindness in purchasing work from the shyest amateurs, of his habit of promising introductions to London dealers that never quite materialized. People who hadn't liked him in life discovered the convenience of praising him in death. People who had liked him discovered the awkwardness of confessing it. Someone remembered a quarrel heard through a hedge, a male voice furious, a female voice cold. Someone else remembered a visit from a man in a motor car with a city number plate. That one, they said, had the look of solicitor and the heart of crocodile. The vicar, who had been doing his brave best to hold a moral line, said gently, "Let us not slander the living or the dead before we know. Grief is a poor diet for gossip." But the diet suited some. Mrs. Jarvis had moved on to tragedy with relish. "You know he wore that scarf always," she told her sister. "He said it was lucky." "Well, that's luck for you." Miss Marple rose and moved toward the edge of the green where the fortune-telling tent still drooped like an embarrassed toadstool. Madame Zulica, Mrs. Dodds again, the turban now crooked as realism reasserted itself, was counting the afternoon's takings with furtive speed. "Such sorrow," she said unprompted, palms lifted halfway in her habitually theatrical manner. "And I told him, mind you, I told him, that a dark lady would be his undoing." "How very prescient," Miss Marple murmured. "Do you remember when you told Mrs. Dyatt that a tall stranger would bring excitement? It was only the new gas meter." Mrs. Dodds half smiled, half winced. "You puncture my art, Miss Marple." "It is only that art, like life, profits by exactness," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Tell me, dear, did you see anyone go into the exhibition tent by the side flap?" "The side? Oh, yes, I did, now you mention it." A practical soul lifted the canvas. "I thought it was Mr. Coombs." No, he was fussing near the tea. Perhaps it was young Thomas. "The cap, you see, he wears it like a seaman. "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Caps do disguise foreheads, but not shoulders." "Shoulders." "Thomas stoops," Miss Marple said. This person did not. She left Mrs. Dodds with her coins and moved on. At the marquee entrance, Constable Hargreaves held up a large hand. "Best keep out," he said, and then more confidentially, "Doctor says, well, best not to say just yet, but there's a scarf, you know." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. Her gaze slid past his shoulder to the trestle table, just visible inside. The overturned sketch pad lay there still, one corner stubbornly bent. Beside it, a vase of spring flowers, cornflowers and something white, had been knocked and righted again. Water lay in a thin shining crescent on the wood, and one petal clung like a tear to the lip of the vase. The palette knife on the floor had been marked with a neat chalk circle, a police nicety that always looked faintly apologetic, as if begging the object's pardon. "Miss Marple," the vicar's wife called. "Hurrying up, Lily Brent is asking for you. She says you were kind to her mother once over the matter of the misunderstanding about the laundry slips." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I was only firm," she said. "Firmness and kindness are often siblings." She turned, then paused, and glanced back at the entrance. A breeze lifted the canvas and let fall a brief glimpse. The blue scarf still snug at the poor man's throat. The silver hair, and just visible against the cream linen of his jacket sleeve, a single dark strand that did not belong. "Strange," she murmured, almost to herself. "What is strange?" asked the constable, who, like many practical men, was suspicious of adjectives that did not come with measurements. "That Mr. Brent," Miss Marple said gently, "was never vain of other people's hair." The remark passed as one of her little jokes, and the constable chuckled politely without understanding. But as Miss Marple crossed the green toward Lily Brent, she arranged behind her mild blue eyes a roster of small facts. The missing boy who may not be missing, the woman who smoked anger like incense, the clerk who flushed too eagerly, the fortune-teller's muddle over shoulders, the scarf that had been called lucky and had done a lucky man no good. None of these, taken alone, amounted to more than gossip, yet together they began to shift ever so slightly into a pattern. And patterns, Miss Marple knew, are merely people repeating themselves. She reached Lily, whose hands trembled once and then steadied. "Aunt Jane," Lily said, using the respectful village fiction, "I don't know what to say to anyone. They all know different pieces of him. None of them fit." "They will," Miss Marple said softly, "in time." "Will you?" Lily swallowed. "Will you come by the cottage presently? There are things. Papers." He was not as careless as people think. "I shall," Miss Marple promised. She glanced back at the marquee one last time. Over it, the sky had dulled a little, as if the day had put away its best face. "First," she added, "I should like to look again at that sketch pad. I have an old-fashioned notion about bent corners." Lily stared at her, uncomprehending but reassured by the calm. Miss Marple gave her arm a light, companionable squeeze and moved away, her steps small and unhurried, her needles clicking faintly in her bag like whispered punctuation. The village would go on talking. It could not help itself. Let them talk. In their talk, the truth, like a shy cat, would sooner or later show its tail. And when it did, she would be watching. Chapter 3. The First Clues and Suspicions. The afternoon sun had grown pale, as though reluctant to shine fully on the day's events. The charity fair, deprived of its former gaiety, wound down earlier than planned. The bunting was taken in, the stalls dismantled with a kind of weary politeness. Yet the marquee of the art exhibition remained cordoned off with a length of white rope, fluttering gently like an uncertain boundary between the everyday and the unthinkable. Miss Marple, having walked Lily Brent back to the cottage, now returned to the green. Constable Hargreaves was standing near the rope, talking with Dr. Felton, who had the slightly harassed look of a man more accustomed to dealing with chilblains and earaches than the drama of sudden death. "Hard might have failed, yes," the doctor was saying, "but that scarf, tight as a noose. Odd business. You'd think a fellow would loosen it, not keep tugging it tighter. And there's bruising. No, not a fall. Thumb pressure, I'd say, but that's for the inquest." Hargreaves nodded with the gravity of a man storing words he could repeat later to sound authoritative. Murder, then? Dr. Felton grimaced. Best not to commit ourselves. But if it is, there's no sign of a struggle. No overturned chairs, nothing smashed. Either he trusted whoever did it, or he never saw it coming. Miss Marple, standing a discreet distance away, bent as if to adjust a strap on her sensible shoes. She caught sight of the palette knife still marked in chalk on the floor, its blade oddly clean. A curious choice for a weapon, if indeed it had been one. Too flimsy to cause much harm, too conspicuous to hide easily. And yet it lay there, inviting notice. When Hargreaves moved off to deal with persistent onlooker, Miss Marple drifted to the rope's edge. The constable's absence allowed her a clearer view of the trestle table. The sketchpad remained where it had been, the bent corner now flattened slightly as though someone had tried, without much care, to smooth it. The drawing on the top sheet showed the beginnings of a portrait, the curve of a jawline, the shading of an eye. It was incomplete, yet unmistakably a man and not Mr. Brent himself. This sitter's hair was darker, the features sharper. The flowers beside the sketchpad had lost a few more petals. The water spill had been wiped clumsily, leaving faint streaks. A scrap of paper clung damply to the underside of the vase. A torn corner, perhaps, of another sheet from the sketchpad. Miss Marple did not attempt to cross the rope. Instead, she stepped back, making a mental note to ask later whether the sketchpad belonged to Mr. Brent or to one of the exhibiting artists. From the path beyond the marquee came a rapid tread. Miss Clarice Vale appeared, cigarette in hand, her coat thrown over her shoulders as though she had no patience for sleeves. She stopped short upon seeing Miss Marple. "You're everywhere today," Clarice said, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Gathering village wisdom?" "Wisdom is like knitting," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It grows best with patience and the proper tension." Clarice blew out smoke. "If you mean gossip, I've had enough of that for a lifetime. They're already hinting I stormed out and came back to throttle him. Ridiculous. You just storm out?" "I left. That marquee lighting was ghastly. And Brent, Adrian, had promised the committee he'd hang my lilies where the afternoon light would touch them. Instead, he tucked them behind a pillar as though ashamed." Her voice wavered between anger and something softer. "Still, I wouldn't kill him for that." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course not, though some quarrels begin over small things and grow to dangerous proportions." Clarice gave her a sharp look, then flicked away her cigarette. "For what it's worth, I didn't see anyone go in after me, but there was an oddness. When I passed the back of the marquee, I thought I heard a man's voice, low, insistent. Couldn't make out the words. Perhaps Brent was meeting someone privately. Did you recognize the voice?" Clarice hesitated. "It might have been Thomas Biddle. Or not. I didn't linger." Miss Marple filed this away with the fortune-teller's vague sighting. The back entrance to the marquee was becoming a recurring feature. A small commotion by the tea tent drew them both. Mr. Percy Coombs was in the middle of an earnest explanation to anyone who would listen. "I saw him only half an hour before, chatting with Lily, quite cheerfully. No sign of anything amiss. And then he went off toward the exhibition with that sketchpad under his arm. Odd fellow, always sketching faces. Said he liked catching people unawares." "Sketching faces?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes. Said it told him more than conversation. I never saw the appeal. Seems a bit intrusive. But he was working on something today. Kept glancing about, as if waiting for someone to arrive. That, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. If Mr. Brent had been expecting a visitor or a model, it might explain the absence of struggle. A man intent on capturing a likeness would sit still for anyone he trusted. By late afternoon, Constable Hargreaves had begun taking formal statements. The queue of villagers shuffled forward, each producing a version of events embroidered by personal bias. Mrs. Banbury swore she had seen Miss Vale near the marquee after her departure. Mrs. Lennon insisted Mr. Rowe had been hovering suspiciously with his account book. Mr. Rowe, in turn, muttered about overhearing a heated exchange between Brent and an unidentified male. Young Thomas Biddle, when finally located by the constable, claimed he'd been fetching lemonade for the coconut shy. Didn't go near the art tent, he said, shuffling from foot to foot. But his ears flushed crimson when Hargreaves mentioned the missing picture frame. Miss Marple, watching from a nearby bench, noticed something that no one else seemed to register. Each time the scarf at Brent's throat was mentioned, Lily Brent's hands tightened on her gloves until the leather creaked. It could be grief, of course. Grief made people fixate on details, but the look in her eyes was something sharper, more guarded. When Lily excused herself to return to the cottage, Miss Marple rose as well. She caught up with her halfway down the lane. "My dear," she said gently, "I wonder, did your uncle often wear that blue scarf?" "Yes," Lily said at once. It was his signature. People expected it. He said it gave him a certain distinction. And today? Was it the same scarf he usually wore? Lily hesitated. I don't know. Perhaps. Why? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said lightly. But she had noticed earlier that the scarf's weave looked new, the dye brighter than in the photographs she had seen of Mr. Brent at past fairs. A replacement or a deliberate substitution? They reached the cottage, a tidy building with roses already climbing its whitewashed walls. Inside, the sitting room bore the marks of an artistic man's life. Canvases stacked against the skirting board, a scattering of brushes and a chipped jug, books on art and poetry in teetering piles. On a side table lay a small wooden box with a broken clasp. Lily noticed Miss Marple's glance. "It's just where he kept odds and ends," she said quickly. "Pencils, scraps, sealing wax. I opened it earlier to find paper for the committee's minutes. That's when the clasp broke." Miss Marple peered in without touching. Amid the clutter was a folded envelope addressed in a neat, unfamiliar hand. The flap was unsealed. Lily caught her breath. "It's from a dealer in London," she explained, too quickly. "Something about a sale. I haven't read it properly." Miss Marple only smiled. Letters can wait until the right moment. Sometimes they speak more clearly after a pause. As she left the cottage, the air cool and damp with the promise of evening, Miss Marple considered the pieces she had gathered. The bent sketchpad corner, the strand of dark hair, the voice behind the marquee, the too-new scarf. None was enough to cry murder with certainty, yet they whispered to her in the familiar language of human folly and concealment. And in that language, silence was often the loudest word of all. Chapter 4, Miss Marple quietly observes. Evening crept into St. Mildred's like a careful guest, tapping politely at window panes, smoothing the color out of hedges and roofs. Lamps bloomed one by one along the high street. Curtains drew together as though village eyes were closing, though they were in fact only narrowing to watch more intently. Miss Marple, who had taken a little broth at home and exchanged her outdoor hat for a softer one that tolerated dusk, went out again with the unhurried tread of a person for whom time is an ally rather than an enemy. She did not go at once to the cottage or the green. Instead, she made a small circuit of the lanes behind the vicarage, where gardens leaned conspiratorially over their fences. People, Miss Marple knew, are never more themselves than when pottering with flowers or shutting a henhouse. A secret is like a dandelion clock. Touch it, and the air is full of telling. At Mr. Rowe's back gate, she paused to admire a patch of wallflowers. Mr. Rowe himself was there, sleeves rolled, watering can tipping in an exact measure that suggests a man who trusted ledgers more than rain. "Pretty, aren't they?" he said, startled into civility. "Dependable plants. You know where you are with a wallflower." Dependable people, too, can be very decorative, Miss Marple observed. "Though I sometimes find that those who say one must know where one is are the very ones who move the signposts." Mr. Rowe's smile tightened. "If you are implying I shift figures, Miss Marple—" "My dear Mr. Rowe," she said sweetly, "I am only thinking of a cousin of mine who insisted her sideboard measure the same as the advertisement, and yet when it arrived it ate half the room. Measurements are so slippery in the hands." He made a noise that could have been amusement or irritation. On his left cuff, Miss Marple noticed a faint streak, greenish-gray, like a smear of underpaint. He followed her glance and tugged the cuff down. "Had a look round the marquee?" he asked with studied casualness. "One sees what one can from a rope," she said. "It is curious, is it not?" That Mr. Brent, who was so fastidious, would have allowed water to stand on the trestle table? Flowers are charming, but they drip. Accidents happen, he said shortly, and debts happen. If you ask me, this is what comes of living beyond one's means. Miss Marple, who had not asked him, let that lie like a coin between them and moved on. In the next garden, Mrs. Jarvis stood with a basket, trimming lavender in brisk snips. Terrible business, she called before Miss Marple could greet her. I always said scarves are unhygienic. Catch all sorts. I told him as much last harvest supper. Did you, dear? Miss Marple said, how practical of you. Lavender is so cleansing, too. I always think its scent clings to the hands. Not half as much as cigarettes, Mrs. Jarvis replied tartly, nodding toward the lane. That painter woman, Miss Vale, left a trail of smoke like a railway. Miss Marple smiled and took the lane. She did not follow the smoke, which had dissipated, but studied the grit of the pathway instead. A narrow set of footprints had pressed the damp along the verge. Light steps, quick, with a turn-in at the right toe. Not Clarice Vale, whose stride was long and unembarrassed. These looked like a person who hurried and tried not to be seen. Thomas Biddle, perhaps. The turn-in was like his. She recalled his cap and his red ears under the constable's questions, and, more importantly, she recalled that Madame Zulica's shoulders had not stooped. Miss Marple stood still a moment, letting the evening sounds sort themselves. A dog barking twice, a kettle lid jittering somewhere, the click of a latch, and from the green, the low rumor of voices. She turned that way and found Constable Hargreaves outside the marquee, confer with Dr. Felton, and with a stranger city cut, narrow tie, felt hat tilted in a way country hats never are. Inspector Dale, the constable introduced with a touch of pride. From county, down quick as you please. The inspector's look was sharp but courteous. Miss Marple, he said, as though the name had been placed discreetly in his ear, I understand you have good eyes. I have needles, Miss Marple said, which was not a contradiction, and experience with snags. He smiled briefly. Good. We shall need both. The doctor thinks the pressure marks on Mr. Brent's neck are consistent with manual force applied before the scarf was tightened. So the scarf, Miss Marple said gently, was perhaps more curtain than cause. The scarf is new, too, the inspector went on. Found the shop ticket tucked into the hem. Bought this week in Kingsbury. We'll check who bought it. Miss Marple inclined her head, concealing a small inner echo of satisfaction. A new scarf was like a new stage property, very seldom introduced without purpose. The sketch pad, she asked, belongs to Brent. Hargreaves put in. He liked to doodle people. Funny business. Not funny at all, Miss Marple said. People often paint what they dare not say. Was there anything under the top sheet? The inspector glanced at a notebook. 2 pages torn out recently, by the look. No sign of them. Miss Marple thought of the damp scrap adhering to the vase and of Lily's unsealed letter. Missing pages, a bent corner, small, untidy facts that would never bother a tidy killer. Whoever did this, the inspector said, was close enough to touch him. No struggle. So either a friend or someone he had no reason to fear. Miss Marple's mind traveled, as it often did in delicate matters, to an old story of St. Mary Mead. The maid-of-all-work who slipped arsenic into Blamont to the face like a church window, and who was never suspected because she smiled at the cat. The cat, however, knew. Cats see hands as much as faces. I shall not be in your way, she murmured, and indeed she drifted from them like thistledown. Across the green, the fortune-telling tent had finally given up and been folded. Mrs. Dodds emerged in her ordinary hat, a bundle under her arm. She looked tired and, for once, untheatrical. You saw shoulders earlier, Miss Marple said, falling into step. Not Thomas's. Mrs. Dodds sighed. Evening makes fools of eyes, Miss Marple. But if you press me, I'd say the person had a set about them. Square. Not young. Not a woman, either. The way the canvas lifted. No fuss. Just up and in. Thank you, Miss Marple said. It is a useful fuss to remember. Outside the parish hall, Miss Clarice Vale sat on the steps, her cigarette finished, her hands empty. Emptiness did not suit her. She was a woman whose fingers were made to grasp brush glass lapel. Now they curled on her knees as if startled by rest. "I'm told there'll be a statement in the morning," she said without looking up. "Am I to be arrested first or later, when the newspapers have got their photographs?" "I do not think Inspector Dale wants photographs," Miss Marple said. "He wants true names for things. That is rarer." Clarice's mouth twitched. Truths are like mirrors. They crack if you heat them too quickly. Very prettily said, Miss Marple replied, "I always remember the case of young Minnie Hargood, who tried to hard-boil an egg in a kettle. She got her egg, but she ruined the kettle, and her mother had to serve visiting clergy with tea that tasted of albumin for a month. Some solutions cost more than they cure." Clarice gave a reluctant laugh. "You are a poet of the domestic." "I have found murder remarkably domestic," Miss Marple said mildly. "Tell me, my dear, what scent you wear?" Clarice blinked. "Scent. It lingers," Miss Marple said, "upon fabric. Here and there about the marquee, I thought I caught a whiff of violets. Not yours, I think. You are more, what is the word? Citrus." "Jasmine Durient," Clarice said, almost offensively. "Violets is old lady stuff. Perhaps Lily wears them? She looks the type." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. But Lily had smelled of soap and starch, and nothing more. She left Clarice and crossed to the cottage, where a lamplight made a dome upon the path. Lily opened quickly, relief and anxiety braided together in her face. "I've put the kettle on," she said. "I can't seem to be comfortable unless it's singing." They sat with cups and a wash plate between them. No cake, for Lily had forgotten cake existed. The room looked subtly rearranged since the afternoon, as rooms do when grief walks through them. A cushion turned, a book straightened, a chair nudged back as if to make space for absence. Miss Marple's eyes noted small plain things. The ashless hearth, the tidy sewing basket, a single long dark hair caught on the arm of the wicker chair by the window. She plucked it delicately and held it a moment against her palm. Not Clarice's, whose hair had a blue-black gloss. This was brown or ordinary, a hair the sort that disappears in crowds. Its presence here was not conclusive. Hairs travel on sleeves and weather and habit, yet it harmonized unpleasantly with the strand on Adrian Brent's jacket. "Lily," Miss Marple said, "tell me about your uncle's visitors. Not the glamorous ones. The everyday callers." Lily thought, Mr. Rowe for accounts. The vicar sometimes. Mr. Coombs, when Uncle offered a small sketch to the bank's charity window. A gentleman from Kingsbury with catalogs. He was trying to sell Uncle a new heater last month. And, oh, Mr. Brent's framer in Kingsbury sent a boy once. He was surly and smelled of glue. "Frames," Miss Marple said softly. "They mark the edge of things." Lily's hands twisted. They say it was a scarf. But Uncle tightened his scarf only when he was anxious. If someone came in behind him, "Oh, Aunt Jane, it won't be some lurid story, will it? They'll make him ridiculous." "People prefer ridiculousness to wickedness," Miss Marple said and patted her hand. "It lets them sleep." On her way out, she paused at the little table where the broken class box had rested. The envelope still lay there, now ajar as if the air had nudged it. She read, with Lily's nod, the neat lines, a London dealer confirming a purchase of portrait study, mail unfinished, for delivery the following week. Her eyes caught a postscript in a different pen. "Please include the preliminary sketches. Our client is particular about provenance." Preliminary sketches. 2 pages torn from the pad. A buyer who wanted the beginnings as much as the end. Miss Marple thought a long-ago curate who borrowed hymnals and left them unreturned because he liked to see his own pencilings come back to him on Sundays. People are greedy for their own beginnings. Outside, the lane was chill. The inspector's silhouette stood against the marquee. The constable's cap bobbed like a small duty-bound boat. Miss Marple, knitting needles now in her hand for the comfort of their clique, walked past without stopping. She had seen enough for an evening. A new scarf, violet scent where violet women did not go. Paint on a cuff, a hair where a hair need not be, a sketch of a dark-haired man, a buyer who liked origins. She recalled, unexpectedly, the matter of old Mrs. Weatherby's jam cupboard. Everyone blamed the greedy cat. because the cat was always greedy, and yet the culprit was a lodger who disliked jam and therefore felt safe blamed for it. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured, is so tidy in its untidiness. From the green, there came a stir of resolution, the sound of a name being tried on for size by official voices. First suspects are always the easiest. They fit the loudest theories. Miss Marple did not hurry toward it. She preferred the moment before naming, the breath when patterns loosen and one can see the threads. Tomorrow the police would choose their simple answer. Tonight she would lay her knitting flat and count stitches, certain some were picked up that did not belong. Chapter 5. First suspects. The police think it's simple. Morning came in meek and gray, as if the sky had put on its church gloves. St. Mildred's did what English villages always do after a shock. It made tea, straightened doilies, and waited to be told officially what it had already decided privately. A hand-painted notice appeared on the green. Exhibition closed, while the bunting, half unstrung the evening before, hung like unanswered questions. Inspector Dale established a small dominion in the parish hall. A trestle table became a desk. An inkpot and a sheaf of foolscap lent the proceedings a stern, scholastic air. Constable Hargreaves loomed at the doorway like a friendly cupboard. The villagers arrived in a respectful queue, their statements folded neatly inside their opinions. Miss Marple came early and sat on a hard chair in the second row, her knitting placed demurely in her lap. She had the look of a person attending a recital at which she would not clap until the right bar. The inspector began with facts as he preferred to see them. Dr. Felton's preliminary view, manual pressure first, scarf tightened after, and the newness of the blue scarf, ticket in the hem, purchased within the week at a draper's in Kingsbury. He set these upon the table like building blocks and looked pleased with the little wall they made. Opportunity, he said, belongs to those who knew the exhibition's quirks. Back flap, side gap. Motive is likely simple. Quarrel, jealousy, money. We shall start, if you please, with Mr. Thomas Biddle. A small stir ran through the room. Thomas arrived hat in hand, cap stuffed awkwardly into a pocket, ears already pink with self-consciousness. He looked at the floor, which was safer than faces. You quarreled with Mr. Brent last week, Dale said without heat, about a frame. Thomas shuffled. He made a fuss, sir. I brought the wrong size. He said I'd no head for inches. I said frames came as they came. You were seen by the side of the marquee yesterday. Some say they heard your voice. Fetching lemonade, Thomas muttered. For the coconut shy. I never went in the back. Inspector Dale weighed him as grocers weigh apples. For bruises. Where were you between 11:15 and 11? Near the pond, sir, watching the model boats. Ask Mr. Jarvis. He was telling me about a new engine. Anyone else see you? Thomas's ears reddened further. Dunno. I'm not loud like some. Do you own a blue scarf? No, sir. Did you buy one this week in Kingsbury? No, sir. I don't go to Kingsbury unless Mum sends me, and she didn't. Dale made a note in a neat, bone-dry hand. You may wait outside. Miss Marple watched Thomas go. He stooped as usual, the right toe turning in. The shoulders of the person Madame Zulica had described remained squarely elsewhere. Clarice Vale came next, a flare of color against the hall's brown boards even in yesterday's coat. She looked ready to quarrel with the furniture if it made a supercilious creak. You left the exhibition in temper, Dale said. In taste, she corrected. A different thing entirely. You were heard near the back of the marquee. I smoke at the back because your committee prefers not to see women inhale, she said crisply. Yes, I passed by. No, I did not throttle Adrian with a haberdasher's ribbon. He wasn't worth creasing my coat. Did Mr. Brent owe you money? She laughed. A short, bright sound that had frightened several men in its time. Artists owe everybody something. That's not a motive. It's a profession. You're sent. Dale asked almost idly. Violets. Certainly not, Clarice said, affronted. Violets belong to dressing tables with crochet covers. I wear jasmine. Miss Marple's needles made a small, please click. The faint trace she had caught yesterday in the marquee had not been Clarice. Mr. Rowe followed, neat and lugubrious, a man who would apologize to a decimal point. Miss Marple noted the cuff now immaculate, where yesterday a whisper of pain had lain. "You handle finances for Mr. Brent?" Dale asked. I advised him on occasion. He had an imprudent regard for beauty over budgets. "Did he owe you money?" "Only gratitude," Rose said primly. "And one does not bank that. You were seen hovering with your account book." "One is accused of hovering," Rose replied, "when one is, in fact, waiting to be useful. Were you in Kingsbury this week?" "I go Tuesdays for clients," Rose said. "Is Kingsbury a crime? Did you purchase a blue scarf there?" "I do not dress like a flag," he said with a thin smile. "Ask the draper, by all means." Percy Coombs, the bank clerk, bounced in on a nervous spring. He spoke too quickly, like a man trying to keep ahead of his own thoughts. "Terrible thing, Inspector. Terrible. I always said Mr. Brent was, well, not conventional. These things end badly." "Your whereabouts at the time?" Dale asked. "Tea tent," Percy said. "I was helping Mrs. Banbury with cups. I have blisters to show for it." "Kingsbury?" No. Well, yes, this morning," Percy stammered, then flushed. "Our branch has a messenger run." "This morning?" Dale repeated. "We shall come to that." Lily Brent entered last, pale but steady, a handkerchief neatly folded in one gloved hand. Miss Marple admired her poise, even as she watched for the small betrayals of grief. "Miss Brent," Dale said softly, "did your uncle ever wear a different scarf?" "He liked the blue," Lily answered. "He enjoyed being recognized." "Do you wear violet scent?" "No," she said, faintly surprised. "I don't wear scent at all. I'm often in the kitchen." Dale dismissed him for the moment and sent Hargreaves to the telephone in the post office to pester Kingsbury. When the constable returned, his face wore the wholesome pride of a man carrying an egg home intact. "Draper says the scarf sold for cash Wednesday afternoon," Hargreaves reported. "Young assistant remembers because the lady smelled of violets. Well dressed. Said it was a gift. Pale gloves. That's all." "A lady," Dale said. The wall of facts rearranged itself to his satisfaction. "We are now looking," he informed the room, "at jealousy or the sort of resentments that thrive on little gifts. Miss Vale, perhaps, or one of the committee ladies. The scarf's a feminine purchase. The act may be feminine passion." Miss Marple, who had known several women quite incapable of tightening a scarf on a living throat, and several men surprisingly proficient at it, did not comment, nor did she remark that Mr. Rowe went to Kingsbury on Tuesdays, a day transparent even to a draper's memory. What Dale did next was very proper and very simple. He asked Hargreaves to fetch Thomas Biddle to Hall again, and, with a grave kindliness, invited the boy to empty his pockets. A penknife, a string, 2 marbles, and a folded paper were placed upon the inspector's blotter. The paper, when opened, proved to be the fair's duty rota. Dale, undiscouraged, asked to see Thomas's fingernails. They were clean in the country fashion of having been scrubbed that morning, as if cleanliness could be made to last all day. "Your mother keeps you tidy," Dale observed. "Did she ever darn scarves?" "Her own," Thomas said, baffled. "Not gentlemen's." He was released, and Clarice was asked, politely this time, if she would show her gloves. They were stained in the fingers with a thin veil of ash. The thumbs were clean. The inspector looked interested. Miss Marple looked more so. A person who tightens a scarf often tightens from the back or with a forward tug. Thumbs leave their witness. Ash could cover much, but not everything. The morning thinned toward noon. Gossip hung about the porch like impatient sparrows. Miss Marple, whose hearing had sharpened with the years as naturally as other people's dimmed, distinguished the flourishes of Mrs. Lenton, a woman scorned. The brisk wash-day certainty of Mrs. Jarvis. "I smell violets at 20 paces," and the comfortable omniscience of Madame Zulica. "I foretold a gift with blue thread." Inspector Dale, perhaps buoyed by so much amenity, made his tentative pronouncement. "Until evidence says otherwise, Miss Vale answers to the strongest pattern. Temper, proximity, a gift that could be hers." "Could be," Miss Marple agreed serenely and tucked away the phrase. Could be was the village's favorite bridge to wrong answers. She allowed herself a small errand before luncheon. A quiet stroll through the exhibition marquee, now unroped but still marked by chalk circles and the kind of hush that lingers after voices have been invited to leave. She did not touch the trestle table. She only stood near it, looking as old ladies look when they're deciding where to set a trifle dish. The sketchpad's bent corner lay flatter now, as if someone less patient than Miss Marple had winced at the sorter and pressed it down. On the floor, near the side canvas flap, a tiny object gleamed dull and domestic. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. It was a small brass picture hook, the sort used to catch onto a wire on a plaster wall. To the police, it would be nothing. St. Mildred's was full of pictures, full of hooks. Yet this one was out of place. It had a smear of a dark, gummy substance where brass should be bright, and a single, short brown fiber adhered, as if the hook had been pressed briefly against a sleeve, then shaken free. She did not stoop. Miss Marple never stooped in public, if she could help it. She memorized instead the exact relationship between hook and floor seam, between seam and side flap, between side flap and the chair where Adrian Brent had sat. Then she turned away like a lady remembering she had left the kettle on. On the green, she met Percy Coombs, who had taken a walking about with his head high and his nostrils faintly flared, as men do when they are telling themselves they breathe clearer air than other people. A sweetness hung about him, not strong, but there a faint, powdery echo that made Miss Marple think of paper drawers and satin sachets. Parma violets, he offered, catching her look and misreading it as admiration. Hair tonic. The barber says it keeps the scalp youthful. How comforting, Miss Marple said, and tucked that away too. By afternoon, the simple story had dressed itself. An artistic quarrel, a jealous woman, a too-tight scarf. Inspector Dale's wall of facts looked quite pretty from a certain angle. St. Mildred's, grateful to be offered a picture it could understand, nodded sagely and began to decide what cakes to take to Lily Brent. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that pretty walls often hide unlovely passages. She sat at her window with her knitting and let the village talk travel up the lane like summer bees. A new scarf bought by a lady with violet scent. A brass hook lying where hooks did not walk. A smear of gummy darkness, such as framers use when they pretend old things are new again. A bank clerk anointed with youthful fragrance and too many theories. A row of shoulders that made no stoop at all. Toward evening, she closed her work bag and stood. There was one small thing, easily overlooked, that had nudged her all morning. A domestic trifle that did not quite belong where it had been. It would not name a killer, not yet, but it would point a finger, delicately, as a governess points to a smudge on a copybook. She reached for her hat. The next step, she knew, was to pick up that little thread before someone tidied it away. Chapter 6. A hidden clue, overlooked but vital. Miss Marple's little thread, once noticed, refused to stop tickling the mind. She had slept lightly, rising early to boil an egg and mend a cuff, the plain rituals that steady one's thoughts. By 9, she had put on her walking coat and stepped out with her knitting bag, as good a search warrant as any in St. Mildred's, tore the green where the marquee still kept its sulky posture. The police had not yet fully reclaimed the scene. A constable from the next village, new to St. Mildred's politeness, stood guard and allowed Miss Marple to look from a respectful distance. She looked, that was all, like a woman calculating where best to place a trestle if it threatened a draft. Then, with the mildest of cough to distract no one in particular, she let fall her handkerchief near the seam of canvas and floor where, yesterday, something had glimmered dull as an old coin. Handkerchiefs have lives of their own. They slip, they flutter. When hers rose again, it carried with it a small, apologetic object, a brass picture hook with a gummy smear and a short brown fiber clinging like a timid passenger. Miss Marple slipped both handkerchief and passenger into the mouth of her knitting bag and thanked the constable for his care of the public. She did not go home immediately. She made 3 small calls that looked like errands. At the vicarage, she delivered a batch of barley biscuits and admired the new polish on the hall chest. At the post office, she purchased a halfpenny stamp and asked after Mrs. Todd's chilblains. At the parish hall, she peered into the lost property basket, a wicker abyss of odd gloves and dog-eared programs. No blue scarf lurked within. That would have been too obliging, but there was a tiny twist of brown paper, empty, stamped down into a corner. Miss Marple retrieved it delicately. The paper had once wrapped something small and metal. It smelled faintly of shellac and dust. She put beside the hook in her bag, like two shy acquaintances whom she intended to introduce. Back at her cottage, she laid the items on a saucer and warmed them gently over the kettle's steam. The gummy smears softened and released a modest perfume. The dry, old-fashioned scent of picture varnish, the sort framers use when they coax the years onto something that does not possess them honestly. Miss Marple, who had had a cousin who varnished everything including his umbrella handle, recognized it at once. She teased free the fiber with a pin and held it to the light. Short, brown, and stiff, wool from a serviceable jacket rather than a lady's coat. Not Clarice Vale's blue-black glamour, not Lily's neat cotton. A village man's tweed, perhaps brushed against the hook in haste. The hook, then, had been in a pocket near varnish or in a drawer near glue. It had been carried into marquee and shed near the side flap. Hooks do not travel alone unless a person forgets to return them to their proper wall. And why would a person bring a picture hooked to an exhibition of pictures already hung unless he had been habitually preoccupied with frames? Hanging them, moving them, making the old look agreeable again. Miss Marple set the saucer on the sill to cool and brought out, from her knitting bag's lining, another small prize she had collected with the innocence of a robin gathering fluff, a crescent of paper that had been clinging, damp and obstinate, to the vase yesterday. Dry now, it showed a ragged edge at the top and, along one side, a faint smear of graphite that looked almost but not quite like the tail of a letter. The torn corner belonged to a page that had been pulled out in haste, likely one of the missing preliminary sketches a London dealer so particularly wanted. In haste, someone had knocked the vase, and the wet clung to what guilt had made careless. A pattern began not with trumpets, but with a small domestic harmony she loved. Hook to varnish, varnish to frame, frame to missing sketches to money, money to motive. It was a poor, ordinary motive, which is why it so often went undetected. People prefer their murders cast in romance. Money wears a dull coat and slips by. She visited Lily Brent again before noon. The cottage, tidier even in sorrow, had the cheerful smell of floor polish and bread toasting. Lily's determination that life should continue without demanding anyone's permission. In the sitting room, Miss Marple's, I moved not to the only obvious gap. There was none, but to the modest wall where small frames are allowed to congregate without pretension, ancestor-like photographs, a pencil study of the church tower, a primroses in a tumbler, painting by an earnest schoolgirl. One of the smaller frames showed the bare ghost of an outline upon the wall where it had been, an oval of paler wallpaper, exposed when someone had dusted less frequently than pride would admit. The frame presently hung a little lower and to the left. The newer nail caught the light. "Lily, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "did you move that little photograph?" Lily followed her gaze and frowned. "No. Oh, I suppose Uncle must have. The other evening. He said the arrangement wanted balance. He was always trying things at different heights. And the old nail? In the drawer of the hall table, I think. He said never to throw away a good nail. But that one bent." Miss Marple nodded, as if 2 + 2 had made a polite 4. "May I look at his sketching things again?" Lily brought the box with a broken clasp. Pencils, a nib, 2 stumps of charcoal, sealing wax, a stick of brownish varnish for retouching, a small length of framer's wire, and Miss Marple's heart made a modest, private movement. A few spare brass hooks. One wore a smear of the same gummy darkness as the saucer at home. Lily saw nothing to remark in this. She was thinking about the photograph. "He sketched so many people," the girl murmured. "He said faces confess when they rest." "Uncle Adrian was right," Miss Marple said. She lifted the wire without touching it. Was he expecting to sell a portrait study? Lily went rather still. "There was a letter," she admitted, "on the table, from a dealer. He had a buyer who wanted an unfinished male study. Uncle showed me a drawing last week, just an eye and a jaw. He said it might do very well. I told him not to be silly about money and to pay Mr. Rowe. He smiled and said artists must always be silly about money or pictures never get made." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "And did he keep the preliminary sketches tidy?" "Yes." He said beginnings were proof. He tucked them under the top page. He liked the weight, the bent corner, the torn pages. The vase. Miss Marple eased the box close, lay her palm briefly over Lily's clenched fingers, and rose. In the hall, she paused. The hall table drawer did indeed hold a nail bent. Beside it lay a paper bag from a Kingsbury shop. Not the drapers, but Cribb and Son, frame makers and gilders. The bag had been opened and smoothed as if someone had considered whether it might be handy for something else. Cribb and Son, Miss Marple observed aloud, a conversational bridge to nowhere in particular. I remember their father. He believed everything could be improved with molding. She smiled and went away before Lily had to find an answer. Her next call, under the perfectly respectable pretext of buying a new teapot strainer, was upon the High Street ironmonger, whose wife, Mrs. Hales, kept the sort of counter that collected confidences as a hedge collects sparrows. Miss Marple admired a display of hooks. Picture hooks go out like hot buns this time of year, Mrs. Hales volunteered. Between spring cleans and the fete, half the village is hammering. Mr. Rowe took a packet yesterday. Said a client had him rehanging a gallery at home. Gallery? She laughed. 3 watercolors of cows and a cousin in a hat. Mr. Rowe is very methodical, Miss Marple said. Methodical? Mrs. Hales warmed to the theme. He bought varnish 2 weeks ago. Says it evens something. I always think varnish is a cheat, but what do I know? And Mr. Coombs, now there's a gent for sense. Half my sachet sold when he took to that hair tonic. Smells like sweets, it does. Parma violets, Miss Marple agreed amiably. My niece used to keep them in drawers to make linen believe it was loved. Armed with her teapot strainer and those stray, obliging sentences, Miss Marple crossed to the bank. It is astonishing what can be learned at a bank by a woman with an air of not wishing to know anything. Percy Coombs was at his high desk, smelling faintly of youth and confectioner. He reddened with a mixture of vanity and worry when Miss Marple asked, oh so vaguely, if Kingsbury were busy in the mornings. Bustling, he said, especially the drapers. Ladies from all around. And Cribbs, of course. They had a run on hooks this week. Someone said the exhibition wants rehanging. Does it? Miss Marple asked, pleasantly surprised. Who told you that, dear? Mr. Rowe, Percy said, and then bit his lip as if he had trodden on a secret. He said, Mr. Brent was particular. Particular? Miss Marple echoed. Yes. She gazed past Percy's shoulder to the bank's charity window where, among the causes, a small pencil sketch of a boy's profile had been propped, one of Adrian Brent's little gifts to the village. The glass had been cleaned recently. A tiny track of smear led from one corner where a cloth had been too enthusiastic. Under the frame lay a spare brass hook. People are always leaving hooks where pictures have briefly been. As she stepped back into the street, she nearly collided with Inspector Dale. He looked less certain today, as men do when their neat walls begin to leak. Miss Marple. A word, he said. The draper confirms a lady with violet scent bought the scarf for cash. We found nothing to tie Miss Vale to Kingsbury that day. But Mr. Rowe's clerk says the accountant was there in the afternoon. Clients. And there's this. He produced a small envelope. Inside, a gray flake that looked like skin. Under Mr. Brent's collar. Varnish. The inspector said grim. Our lab says so. Dear me, Miss Marple said softly. How adhesive life can be. He peered at her. You have that look again. Only the look of a woman who has just bought a teapot strainer. It promises order in a world of leaves. She hesitated. Inspector. It is sometimes useful to ask not who bought the scarf, but who knew that a shop assistant would remember a violet scent. People can be very obliging when you tell them what they smelled. He frowned, then half smiled despite himself. You mean someone borrowed a smell? Or carried it, Miss Marple said, thinking of Percy's bright hair and sweeter scalp. Scents are terrible gossips. They attach themselves quite without propriety. Back at her cottage she arranged, on the saucer, the hook, the brown paper twist from Cribb and Son, and the faintly penciled torn corner. Together they made nothing so crude as a confession. Together they made a direction. And as if to confirm the importance of the smallness, a subtle disturbance passed across her hedge. Someone pausing just a heartbeat too long by her gate, then moving on. Miss Marple, who had lived too long to believe in innocent breezes, did not go to the window. She merely lifted the saucer and slid it into her work basket beneath the wool, where objects are as safe as thoughts. Only the real killer, she reflected, would care that a humble hook had gone missing from the marquee. Only the real killer would come creeping back to see if anyone else had eyes for it. She took up her knitting, the clack-clack a soft metronome to thought, a hook that smelled of varnish. A village man's will brush against it. A bank clerk baptized in violets, an accountant methodically purchasing what pictures required to appear respectable, sketches torn in a vase that protested the speed. The police had their lady with a scarf and a temper. Miss Marple had, at last, something much better, a small, unglamorous fact that would not be contradicted by any amount of talk. And with that fact tucked neatly where only a tidy woman would think to look, she was ready, when the village's pretty wall began to crumble, to show the narrow passage behind it. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Secrets. By the following morning, the stillness in St. Mildred's was not peace but pressure, like the air before a storm, heavy with things unsaid. It was in a way doors opened half an inch when footsteps passed, in the hesitant pause before good morning, and in the small, sharp glances traded over shop counters. Inspector Dale had declared that lines of inquiry were being pursued, which the village naturally interpreted as meaning that suspicion was now free to wander where it liked. And it did, over tea, over potatoes in the greengrocer's, over hymn books at the church. Miss Marple, walking to the high street for bread, saw Mrs. Linton speaking with a crisp vigor to Madame Zulica outside the post office. "And I told him," Mrs. Linton was saying, "that temper was one thing, but murder quite another." "You speak as if they were cousins," Madame Zulica returned with relish. "I still say the scarf was fate's chosen thread. I saw it in the cards, a coil, a twist." "Cards," sniffed Mrs. Linton, "are for people who can't read character." "Then you must be a most gifted woman," Miss Marple said as she passed. The mildness of her tone belied the glint in her eye. At the baker's, she found Percy Coombs ahead of her, leaning across the counter to charm Miss Blunt into wrapping his currant buns just so. His hair gleamed as if each strand had been coaxed into line by diplomacy. When Miss Marple entered, he straightened with a little flourish. "Morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard the latest? Mr. Rose says Brent's niece has been to bank to look over his accounts. Imagine, already, what must that tell us?" "That she is careful," Miss Marple said, taking her loaf. "Carefulness is a good habit. So few cultivate it, preferring instead to make a great display of knowing other people's business." Percy flushed faintly, but recovered quickly. "Well, if I were the police, I'd be looking closely at those finances. Brent had debts." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And sometimes debts have more than one creditor." She left him to his buns and continued toward the green, where Inspector Dale was speaking earnestly to Lily Brent. Lily's hands were folded before her, fingers twined tightly together. Her chin was lifted, but her eyes darted like a bird's. "You must understand," Dale was saying, "that it's not unusual to ask about personal matters at a time like this. Did your uncle keep cash in the house?" "Only small amounts. Most went through the bank," Lily said. "I can give you his passbook, if you wish." Dale nodded, clearly pleased. "And his will, do you know its contents?" "Yes," Lily said softly. "Everything to me. There's no one else." Miss Marple, who had paused just far enough away to seem polite, heard the murmur and stored it with care. Everything to Lily. That could make a motive in the eyes of some, or a temptation in the hands of another. When Dale moved off, Miss Marple approached Lily with a smile. "My dear, it is wearing, isn't it? All these questions, as if answers were seeds to be planted in neat rows." Lily's lips curved in a faint attempt at a smile. "They have to ask. I know that." She hesitated, then said, "It's the things they don't ask that bother me. Such as, they haven't asked who might have wanted his sketches. Uncle was particular about them. And the one he was working on, someone must have known it would fetch a price. Perhaps they think it was only the finished work that mattered," Miss Marple said gently. "Not everyone understands the value of beginnings." A few minutes later, Miss Marple found herself intercepted by Mr. Rowe outside the ironmonger's. He was an unusually high color, his eyes bright as if he walked fast or argued recently. "I suppose the whole village thinks they're detectives now," he said with a short laugh. "Half a dozen people have asked me whether Brent owed me money, as if a professional would discuss such things in public." "You must find it vexing," Miss Marple said. "People are often eager to imagine connections where none exist." "Exactly," Rose said, with almost too much relief. "And I'll tell you something else. They're looking in the wrong places. All this nonsense about scarves and tempers, when what they ought to ask is who knew about that buyer in London. A tidy sum, I hear, worth more than the rest of Brent's work put together." "Indeed?" "Oh, yes," Rose said, his voice growing expansive. "And if someone took those sketches, they'd have to know how to make them look legitimate. Provenance, Miss Marple, provenance. Without it, art's just paper and paint." "Very true," Miss Marple murmured. "And you've always been such a stickler for proper documentation." Roe glanced at her sharply, then smoothed his expression. "Well, of course, accuracy is everything." By late morning, the air of polite conversation had thickened into something more brittle. Clarice Vale appeared on the green, head high, her coat swinging with each stride. She cut across the grass toward Lily Brent, stopping a fraction too close. "You might at least tell me if you're keeping it," Clarice said in a low, tight voice. "I don't know what you mean," Lily replied, equally low. "The portrait," Clarice hissed. "He promised it to me. It wasn't his to give, not if he meant to sell it." "Oh!" "Don't be sanctimonious, Lily. You've no idea what things cost, or what they cost to make." Clarice's voice softened to something almost like persuasion. "I could have got it into a gallery. I could have made his name. And the price," Lily said sharply. "Who would have got that?" The silence between them was quick and hot. Then Clarice laughed lightly and stepped back. "Keep it then, if you can find it." She turned on her heel and left the green without another glance. Miss Marple had drifted to the bench nearest them, appearing absorbed in untangling her yarn. She had no need to strain her ears. People in the grip of grievance always underestimate the carrying power of their own voices. After Clarice departed, Lily sat very still for a moment before rising and walking briskly toward the lane. Miss Marple, curious, followed at a distance that could be explained by coincidence. Lily went not to the cottage, but to the parish hall, slipping inside by the side door. 5 minutes later, Percy Coombs emerged from the same door, glancing over his shoulder before crossing the green at a fast clip. His hair caught the light, so to the small brass key he turned absently in his hand. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed a fraction. A brass key could open many things, drawers perhaps, or a cupboard where one might place items awaiting removal. And Percy, with his eager helpfulness and too bright manner, was precisely the sort who might do a favor for someone else without stopping to ask why it was wanted. By the time she returned home, the village mood had shifted again. Mrs. Banbury was telling anyone who would listen that she'd heard the police were certain it was Miss Vale. Madame Zulica, by contrast, favored a man of means and neat habits, which several took to mean Mr. Rowe. Miss Marple made tea, sat in her favorite chair, and began to knit. Her mind moved easily between stitches and facts. The brass hook with varnish, the brown paper twist from Crib and Son, the torn sketch corner, Clarice's demand for the portrait, Percy with a key, Rowe discoursing on provenance. And beneath it all, the knowledge that secrets, once disturbed, tend to jostle against one another until they spill. St. Mildred's was a small place. There was no room for every hidden thing to stay comfortably concealed. She suspected the next days would see more than one person's private business dragged into the light, not all of it directly related to Adrian Brent's death, but all of it useful, because in villages, as in Miss Marple's knitting, every drop stitch shows eventually. When she set her needles down, it was with the sense that the fabric was beginning to take shape. Not enough yet to name the pattern, but enough to know it would not match the one the police thought they were making. Chapter 8. Another twist, smoke, silence, and a vanished sketch. The day after the village's tempers had rattled their teacups, a queer hush lay upon St. Mildred's. It was not the soft quiet of Sunday, but a listening kind, Windows ajar. Gates not quite latched, as though houses held their breath in case a name was spoken that would not be forgiven. Shortly after 10, Miss Marple, returning from posting a letter, paused by the green. Inspector Dale stood with Constable Hargreaves beside the drooping mouth of the exhibition marquee, their discussion low and clipped. A boy from the grocer's pedaled by, tossed the word Kingsbury over his shoulder like a newspaper headline, and vanished down the lane. Miss Marple. Dale called, with the air of a man greeting, willingly or not, an ally. Small development. The draper's girl now thinks the violet lady had a veil spotted. Helpful if true. Also, Crib and Son confirmed Mr. Rowe collected framing wire Wednesday afternoon. Says it was for a client. Clients are very accommodating, Miss Marple said. They allow one to do as one pleases and call a professional. Before Dale could reply, Lily Brent came running across the green, no hat, her gloves clutched rather than worn. Inspector and Jane, please. She spoke too quickly to be understood. It was not until Hargreaves put a paternal hand on her elbow and said, Now, miss, that the sense reached him in pieces. The cottage, a smell, smoke, something wrong with the heater. She had only gone for the bin. When she returned, the house was full of it, and the sitting-room window stood open like a shout. Dale straightened as if a string had been pulled. Hargreaves, he began. But Miss Marple was already moving, her small steps precise, the set of her jaw the one she wore when a cake threatened fall. They went together down the lane, Lily half running, half stumbling, apology and panic fighting in her throat. At the cottage gate the smell met them. Not the wholesome, tragic smell of a proper blaze, but a sickly mixture. Paraffin sulk, varnish's dry sweetness, and something metallic, like a penny sucked too long. The front door stood ajar in a way that suggested it had been made to look ajar. Smoke gathered sulkily along the ceiling, reluctant to depart. Don't go in, Dale ordered, but Miss Marple had already put her handkerchief to her mouth and stepped to the threshold. Not a fire, she said calmly. A fuss. Open the back door, Constable. Let the house have its temper in the garden. They did as she said. A draft woke and carried the smoke out with a weary sigh. On the sitting-room hearth, the little oil heater sat skewed, its wick blackened, its cap off as if it had been interrupted in the act of misbehavior. Beside it, a small square of newspaper was charred at the edge where someone had tried to help flame with paper and then changed their mind. The window latch had been sprung with something that knew about stubbornness, knife or strong wire. The sill bore a pair of shallow, square impressions where forearms, steady ones, had leaned. Lily, white and steady now the immediate fright had passed, stood stricken in the doorway. I only went to bins. 10 minutes, no more. When I came back, I smelled it from the lane. Oh, Inspector and Jane. Nothing's burned that cannot be polished, Miss Marple said, but her eyes had gone to hall at once, to the small table, its drawer no longer prim but gaping, and then to the sitting-room's corner where the broken glass box had been. It was gone. In its place a small, neat square of undisturbed dust marked where it had sat. A person had lifted that box clean, careful not to smudge what could accuse. Lily, Dale said gently, what was in the box? Pencils, bits, hooks, wire, his sketch. She broke off and put her hand to her mouth. The letter, the dealer's letter. Oh, but I left that on the table. The table, which had been innocent all its life, looked suddenly complicit. The letter was not there. Hargreaves bent the hearth, coughed, and fished in the ash with a poker. He brought out the blackened ghost of paper. Half an envelope. The flap scorched away, the imprint of a London address just surviving in raised dots where the pen had pressed. Someone tried to feed it, he said, dismayed. Someone, Miss Marple murmured. Who knows that letters, like people, talk more before they're entirely destroyed? Dale moved the window. The sill's paint was rough where it had taken a scrape, forced from outside, and the heater, set deliberately to smoke us off the scent while they made off with what they wanted. He turned to Lily. Miss Brent, was anything else disturbed? Lily shook her head, then paused, as the eye of habit measured its room. The oval photograph, Aunt Ellen, was there. She pointed to the low, humble gallery, now it's a fraction lower, and Uncle's little study of the church tower. He never hung it that high. He said the spire looked haughty. Frames have been handled, Miss Marple said, not clumsily, with a framer's conscience. Inspector, might I see the back of one? He nodded. She lifted the church tower gently, turned to the light, and laid a finger to the wire. Fresh. The brass hook, new. The nails, one bright, one older, along the lower stretcher. A smear of something brownish, gummy, catching a thread from a rough tweed cuff. She did not need her saucer at home to tell her what it was. Whoever came, Dale said, was looking for something specifically. The preliminary sketches, Miss Marple said, more to Lily than to the inspector. The letter asked for them, you recall, and they are proof that the work and any companion scrap tucked with it began under Adrian Brent's hand. Without them, a found drawing is only a story. With them, the story grows a spine. Lily pressed her lips together. But why? Oh, Aunt Jane, why not simply take the finished sheet from the sketch pad at the marquee? Why come here? Because the sketch pad, if it still holds anything, holds only one thing, Miss Marple said softly. Preliminaries are plural, and plural things hide better. Also, there are other papers, receipts, notes, the sort of dull details dealers like. She looked to the hearth, and someone preferred them silent. Dale had begun to pace, a tidy man whose lines had been smudged. So, an intruder with wire and confidence who knows frames, who knows about provenance, who is not frightened by smoke and fiddly latches, and who came in daylight betting on a 10-minute errand. That does not sound like a temper. It sounds like a plan. Yes, Miss Marple said. And plans, like cakes, rely on timing. 10 minutes is about long enough for paraffin to speak and for a letter to scorch, if one is not surprised by a returning footstep. Lily made a small sound, half relief, half horror, at the thought of what she had narrowly missed. A deeper inhale, a stumble, a fall in a room that had decided to be stupid rather than murderous. Miss Marple took her hand and squeezed it. The house sulked. It did not bite, she said. There is that to be grateful for. Hargreaves, peering at the sill, grunted. Boot marks on the outside path. Big feet, square. Not the boys, his turn in. Not a lady's. We'll cast them. Boots and shoulders, Miss Marple murmured, remembering Madame Zulica's practical intruder. Yes. Dale sent Hargreaves to fetch his kit and, with a gentleness that sat oddly with his sharp eyes, asked Lily to make a list of anything missing. Leave money for the moment, he said. Think like a tidy thief. What could be taken without noise? What could be put under a coat? What hides in a flat object? When he turned back, Miss Marple was looking at the mantel. She tapped it very lightly. Inspector, do you see? The dust here has a clean, small square. A thing stood here and stands no longer. They bent together. Yes, a rectangle had been lifted. Not large, the size of a postcard in a narrow frame. What was here? Dale asked. Lily looked stricken. Uncle had lately put a little study there. Just an eye and a jaw. He said it encouraged him to finish properly, being nagged by his own beginnings. I told him he was silly. A preliminary pinned up to remind a man not to forget himself, Miss Marple said. And now, someone else prefers he be forgotten. Dale swore under his breath, very quietly, like a man mindful of the furniture. Right, we'll search the garden and the lane. Hargreaves, prints, plaster, the lot. Miss Brent, you'll stay with Mrs. Banbury for the hour. Miss Marple. I shall make Lily a cup of very bossy tea, Miss Marple said, and did, boiling the kettle until it scolded. By noon, the cottage had ceased coughing its complaint. Lily, steadier, left with Hargreaves' wife to be fussed over by domestic competence. Dale examined the window again, measuring distances with a folded notebook. He knew exactly where to come, he said. 10 minutes. In, out. He did not rummage. He selected. Miss Marple said carefully, or someone who borrows a man's edges. There's a great deal of that. Borrowed sense, borrowed shoulders, borrowed errands. Dale shot her a look. You think Miss Vale put on boots and squared her shoulders? No, Miss Marple said serenely. Miss Vale would rather starve than stoop. But there are men who stand helpfully where someone points, and men who enjoy appearing useful because it reflects well upon them. Coombs, Dale said, and then grimaced at himself for saying it. He has a key to half the parish hall cupboards, I'm told. But why here? Because a helpful man is easily lent, Miss Marple said. And a careful man, one who buys hooks and wire and talks about Providence, knows which house is empty for 10 minutes. Dale rubbed his temple. Row, or both, or neither. Blast it, Miss Marple. The more facts I arrange, the more doors sprout in the walls. Then it is a good house, Miss Marple said comfortably. Bad houses have only one door and ask you to admire its paint. They left the cottage secured and came, by quiet accord, round the back of the parish hall. The side door had acquired a new brass keel, freshly polished, as though hoping to be praised. Miss Marple, without comment, straightened a mat that had been turned 1/4 of an inch in a manner no true caretaker would tolerate. Within, the small anteroom that kept brooms and folded chairs smelt faintly of paraffin and something else, sweet powdery, not the room's own. On a high shelf, where the busy never look, there was a dustless gap with a wafer of paper curl caught to the wood. Dale reached. He was tall where Miss Marple was sensible, and brought down from a deeper recess nothing, only the mark where a flat thing had lain, and a lint of brown fiber like the one Miss Marple had teased from the hook. He sniffed. Paraffin and violets, he said with distaste. Good Lord, the village is scented like a sweet shop. People like to leave traces that say what they wish to be, Miss Marple said. Very few consider what else they drag along. A door closed somewhere in the hall. Percy Coombs, hat in hand, appeared with a bright, rehearsed surprise of a man who has practiced being innocent in a mirror. Inspector, Miss Marple, Mrs. Banbury asked for the petty cash tin. There's a jumble sale money float. Of course, Dale said, so pleasantly that Percy relaxed before his time. Tell me, Mr. Coombs, did you happen to tidy this cupboard this morning? Percy's gaze flicked, bird-like, to the mat Miss Marple had straightened. Me? No. Well, perhaps last night after the committee finished. I'm tidy by nature. Father said it was a bank virtue. And your key? Miss Marple asked, equally pleasant. The little brass one you twirled yesterday, does it fit here? Percy colored. Ah, yes. Mrs. Banbury gave it me. I'm to be useful. To everyone, Dale murmured. Percy's smile faltered. In the small silence that followed, the air of the cupboard seemed to thicken with all the things that had rested briefly on its shelf and now were elsewhere. Under coats, in bags, in hands poised between help and harm. By the time Miss Marple walked home, the village's hush had broken into a new sound. The skitter of rumors with fresh feet. There had been a break-in at the cottage. Someone had tried to gas poor Lily. Valuable sketches had been stolen. The police were closing in on whomever the speaker least liked. Clarissa's name crackled. Rose's name creaked. Percy's name fluttered uncertainly like a paper on a wet hedge. Miss Marple made herself a little lunch of soup and a heel of bread, then sat by her window with her knitting, the neat movement of the needles a counterpoint to the disorder outside. A second crime, if you could call it that, had arrived right on time, as such things do when the first story is too tidy to be true. It had brought with it smoke to sting eyes, a missing letter, and the shape of a hand that preferred careful theft to violent proof. She had, now more than a thread, she had a small piece of hem with a name woven in, though she would not say it yet. It is foolish to shout a name while the person still has a habit of coming to the window when you call. And in the shifting air of afternoon, as if to prove that secrets cannot sit still for long, there came a knock at Miss Marple's door, soft, apologetic, the tap of someone who wants to confess something that might not be a sin if told properly. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The web of lies deepens. The knock, soft and uncertain, was followed by the faint scuff of a shoe upon Miss Marple's doorstep, as though the visitor had shifted weight and nearly thought better the errand. Miss Marple, who never hurried unless preserving the life of a sponge cake, opened the door at her usual gentle pace and found Lily Brent standing there. Her hat was clutched rather than worn, her face pale but intent. "And Jane, may I? I thought perhaps, I didn't know who else to tell." "Do come in, my dear." Miss Marple said, ushering her toward the chair by the hearth. "There's tea in the pot, and if you don't mind currant bread instead of cake, I can see you don't fade away entirely." Lily managed a small smile and sat, hands tight in her lap until the warmth of the cup loosened them. "It's about yesterday, the break-in." She hesitated, eyes darting to the window before lowering her voice. "I don't think they came only for the sketches. I think they wanted something else entirely." "Oh." "I was putting laundry away this morning and found Uncle's account ledger, one he kept in his bedroom, not the studio. At the back was a folded sheet, half torn. It's a letter, but not to him. It's to Mr. Rowe." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That is interesting. From whom?" Lily unfolded the paper from her bag with care. The writing was brisk, almost severe. "The valuation is too low. He will not part with it for less. You must convince him of the market risk. Our agreement stands. No signature, only a scrawled initial that might have been AC or AG. I thought perhaps it was about the portrait," Lily said. "But Uncle told me once that Mr. Rowe wasn't to be trusted with art, only with sums. And the letter makes it sound as if they were working together, pressuring someone. It isn't his handwriting, either." Miss Marple read it again before returning it to her. "People who stand between buyer and seller," she said softly, "often find themselves tempted to widen the gap and keep what falls between." Lily looked startled. "You mean take money?" "Or goods," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes they even take the story, which can be sold in its own way." "What else was in the ledger?" "Mostly numbers," Lily said, but there were 2 entries underlined in red pencil. Frame repair, £2.10 in travel, Kingsbury, £1. Both from last week. Miss Marple tucked that neatly into her mental knitting. Frame repair could be the mending of an old work to make it appear newer, or the adjusting of a new work to seem older. And Kingsbury was, of course, where the scarf had been bought, where Cribb and Son had their framing shop, and where Rowe had made his Tuesday visit. Before she could speak, there was another knock, this one brisk, authoritative. Inspector Dale stepped in without ceremony when Lily answered, his expression one of a man who has learned something that fits a little too well. "Miss Marple," he said, "Hargreaves has matched the boot prints outside the cottage to a pair owned by Mr. Rowe. He says he's never been in your garden, Miss Brent. Of course. He also says he lent those boots to a friend for gardening. Convenient." "Very convenient," Miss Marple murmured. Dale glanced between them. "And another thing. We traced that London dealer, the one who wrote about the portrait. His client's name isn't on the books. Payment was to be in cash, collected in person, no receipts. Our contact says he was approached not by Brent, but by someone claiming to represent him." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "And who might that have been?" "The dealer describes him as a middle-aged man, careful in speech, carrying a folio, smelled faintly of varnish." Lily drew in a breath. "That's Mr. Rowe." Dale's eyes narrowed. "It's possible, or someone who wants us to think so." Miss Marple poured him tea, which he accepted without noticing. "Inspector, you may find the letter Lily has just shown me of interest. It suggests that Mr. Rowe was in correspondence with someone about a valuation, and perhaps about convincing Adrian to sell for less." Dale read the sheet, his mouth a thin line. This could be motive. If Brent refused, the sketches and letter could ensure a sale anyway, if they were in the right hands. "Or the wrong ones," Miss Marple said. After Dale left, Lily lingered, as though reluctant to step back into the village where talk already prowled. "Aunt Jane, do you think Mr. Rowe could have killed him?" Miss Marple considered her answer as she tidied the cups. "I think Mr. Rowe is capable of wanting something enough to arrange for its absence from another's possession. But wanting and killing are not always the same skill. If he did not do the one, he may have been very near the person who did the other." When Lily had gone, Miss Marple set out on a small tour. Her first stop was a post office, where Mrs. Todd was sorting letters with a relish that suggested she read as much as she delivered. "Funny thing," Mrs. Todd said unprompted. "Yesterday a telegram came from Mr. Coombs, from Kingsbury. Said simply, 'Collection confirmed.' He looked as if he'd swallowed a wasp, and then said it was about bank business. But telegrams for bank business don't come to the post office. They go straight to the branch." Miss Marple agreed that it was funny indeed and bought a sheet of stamps she did not require. From there, she crossed to the vicarage, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book. The vicar's wife, ever obliging, mentioned that Percy Coombs had been seen speaking with Clarice Vale in the churchyard after dark 2 nights ago. Quite a lively exchange, she said. I thought perhaps they were arranging some art thing, though Percy is more the numbers type. By the time Miss Marple reached home, the day's pattern was clearer. Rowe, with his boots, varnish, and frame knowledge, clearly tied to the sketch's value. Coombs, with his violet scent and new telegram, perhaps acting as messenger or go-between. Clarice, with a personal stake in the portrait and a temper well aired in public. And somewhere among them, the thread that led directly to the blue scarf, the unmarked violence, and the vanished work. The connections were no longer linear. They formed a small, tight web where the strands touched in unexpected places. Clarice and Percy in the churchyard, Rowe and an unnamed correspondent pressing for a sale. The scarf, purchased in Kingsbury by a violet lady, and Percy's habit of carrying that scent in his hair. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting in her lap, thought of a fly that lands on a web without noticing the tension in the threads, until it tries to leave and finds that movement only tightens a hold. That, she suspected, was where the killer now stood, still waiting, hoping the web would be mistaken for air. But she had spent a lifetime seeing the glisten of silk where others saw nothing at all. And now, she thought it was time to give the web a small, deliberate shake. Chapter 10. The Quiet Snare. The following afternoon brought a brittle sunshine to St. Mildred's, one of those deceptive days when the village looks freshly washed yet the air carries a faint bite. Miss Marple had invited Inspector Dale, Lily Brent, Clarice Vale, Mr. Rowe, and Percy Coombs to the vicarage drawing room under the guise of helping Mrs. Banbury sort the fate accounts. In truth, the vicarage was simply large enough to gather everyone without causing the sort of roadside spectacle the village would gossip about for months. They came with varying degrees of suspicion and self-control. Rowe, precise as a ledger column. Clarice, cool and perfumed, a silk scarf knotted at her throat as though to prove she feared none. Percy, a little pale but making a show of cheerfulness. Lily, quiet and watchful. Inspector Dale stood slightly apart, arms folded, content to let Miss Marple play her hand. She began gently, with tea poured in her unhurried way. "It is such a pity," she remarked conversationally, "when a thing's beginnings are lost. A dropped stitch will never quite match again, however you try to disguise it. And sometimes, you see, it's the beginnings people will pay most for." Clarice's brows drew together. Rowe's eyes flickered. Miss Marple went on, as if musing to herself. Adrian Brent had a portrait study, a man's face in outline, and the preliminary sketches. Those sketches were worth as much as the finished work to a certain buyer in London. The difficulty for the thief was how to sell them without proving their theft. And so, you see, the provenance had to be controlled. Frames changed, notes destroyed, and the sketches made to seem as if they had been in the seller's hands all along. Rowe's lips pressed in. "If you're suggesting—" Miss Marple lifted a hand. "Let us not interrupt the knitting, dear Mr. Rowe. You see, our intruder was a tidy worker, boots square on the path, shoulders broad, a knowledge of frames and varnish, and the sense to know when Lily had stepped away for 10 minutes. He took the broken class box, the sketches, and the dealer's letter, but he could not burn the letter entirely before Lily returned. That was careless." "Careless," Rowe said sharply, "or hurried because—" "Because," Miss Marple continued mildly, "he had an assistant, someone nimble enough to run small errands, someone who could buy a blue scarf in Kingsbury without drawing attention, carrying a borrowed violet scent. So the shopgirl's memory would later point away from the truth. That assistant could also be trusted to hide stolen work for a short while, perhaps in a cupboard at the parish hall, until it was safe to pass it on." Percy swallowed audibly. I help Mrs. Banbury all the time." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly, "and in helping her, you help others too. The telegram from Kingsbury, collection confirmed, was not bank business at all. It was to tell you the buyer was ready. That's why you met Miss Vale in the churchyard after dark. She thought the portrait was for her. She learned otherwise. I dare say words were exchanged. Clarice gave a short, bitter laugh. You think I'd strangle a man over a picture? I wanted it, yes, but I'm no killer. No, Miss Marple said, her gaze resting on Roe. You are not. The killer was the one person who could combine the tidy removal of art, the suppression of the paper trail, and the confidence to walk into Marquis in daylight without causing alarm. Mr. Roe, you had quarreled with Adrian over money and his refusal to let you handle the sale. You knew the buyer, and you stood a profit most if you could present the work yourself. You came in by the side flap, greeted him as if to discuss framing, and, standing behind his chair, pressed the scarf tight after your hands had already subdued him. Then you staged the scene to point toward a jealous woman. The palette knife on the floor was theater. The bent sketchpad corner was your haste in tearing out the preliminary sheets. Roe's voice was low and deliberate. That is an elaborate tale for an old woman to spin. It is a plain tale, Miss Marple corrected, made from small, plain facts, varnish on a brass hook found by the side flap, a fiber from your jacket on it, fresh wire and hooks bought in Kingsbury the same day as the scarf, the boot prints at Lily's cottage, the letter from your correspondent urging you to persuade Adrian to part with the work, and, of course, your own visit to the dealer in London under pretense of representing him. Inspector Dale stepped forward, his voice brisk. We confirmed all of that, Roe. The dealer picked you out without hesitation. You'll come with me. Roe's composure cracked, not into anger, but into a thin smile that held a kind of weary resignation. You make it sound as if art were a crime in itself. Not art, Miss Marple said. Her tone as gentle as if she were remarking on the weather, merely the stealing of it and the life that went with it. He was led away without fuss, the door closing softly behind them. Clarice gave a small, satisfied shrug. Percy looked as if he might faint. Lily sat very still, her teacup unmoved in her hand. After the others had gone, Lily turned to Miss Marple. How did you know it was him? And Jane. I thought the scarf pointed to a woman. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, scars may be bought by anyone. But picture hooks with varnish, boots with square toes, and a man's certainty that he can tidy away his trail. That is quite another thing. It reminded me of a case in St. Mary Mead where a very neat young curate stole his own bicycle to claim the insurance. He forgot only one thing, to dust a footprint off his pantry shelf where he had hidden it. People who pride themselves on orderliness often leave the clearest signs, because they cannot imagine anyone looking in the places they had declared in order. Lily gave a shaky laugh, then a sigh. Will the sketches be found? I expect so, Miss Marple said, settling her knitting in her lap. People who hide things in safe places usually hide them too well to carry far. Outside, the village was already adjusting its story. By evening, Roe would be both a criminal mastermind and a fool. Clarice would be either his accomplice or his victim, depending on the teller, and Percy's violet-scented errands would be recast as gallant acts of village loyalty. Life would go on politely, as it always did in St. Mildred's, and in the quiet of her cottage, with the day's light fading over the rose bushes, Miss Marple took up her needles. The scarf, she reflected, had been only a prop. The true pattern lay in the small, plain stitches that others had overlooked. That, after all, was how the best work, whether in knitting or in crime, was done